Welcome to Millennium Live. My name is Katie Perry, and today I'm joined with Mike Wilkes, who's the CISO at SecurityScorecard. Thanks so much for joining us today, Mike.
Thank you, Katie. I'm happy to be here and share a couple of stories and answer a few questions. But perhaps first I should mention something about Security Scorecard.
Yeah, absolutely. If you could give us a brief background on SecurityScorecard for anyone who's listening or watching who may not know about you.
Yeah, Security Scorecard's a company that I was actually following since 2015. It's a 8-year-old startup, and it's in the business of doing cybersecurity ratings. So you can imagine letter grades A through F. And so the company has built an engine that scores companies based on their visible, publicly accessible endpoints. And so we can actually correlate the likelihood of a breach as being 6 times more likely with somebody with a C grade or lower versus somebody who has an A. And so we basically use the platform to help people in a proactive way, show them what their vulnerabilities are that are internet facing, and to help make the world a safer place. That's our mission.
CISA recently announced a new strategic venture on systemic cyber risk reduction and the emergence of cybersecurity ratings as an important risk qualification. So, why are security risks so important?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And it was really quite monumental for CISA, the Critical Infrastructure and Security Agency, to work on calling out systemic risk and ways to reduce it, and the importance of cybersecurity ratings. I think that ratings are necessary, but I don't think they're sufficient. They're a necessary tool in the arsenal of security teams so that we can measure and validate those external signs of risk. It uses something called OSINT, open source intelligence, and it provides troves and troves of valuable data that the bad actors are using to plan their attacks. So it only makes sense that we too make use of that same data to understand our risk posture and to those of our third parties, our vendors and our providers and service providers. So discovery, for example, of rogue IT or forgotten infrastructure that somebody provisioned is something that we've automated because we're scanning the internet every month. In some network segments, we actually scan every day because they're changing so frequently, like cloud service providers. But we combine that with continuous monitoring of your security rating and for those of your third parties and vendors. And we are able to create event-based assessments. And it's a very powerful automation and combination. A score drop, for example, from a B to a C, or a breach report that reaches us through our data feeds. These are event-based assessments. It's a really great way to automate monitoring thousands of vendors potentially and not having to scale up your team linearly to do that. And I think there's a couple of different kinds of risk that CISA is talking about. When they talk about systemic risk, I think there's a risk that comes from things that we don't really talk about, sort of things that are embedded in the system. And there's a complexity element to it as well. So we as managers, we have to execute a plan. And as leaders, we have to manage scarcity. But as executives, we have to really manage ambiguity. And I think here, how do we address the uncertainty of increasingly complex systems that we're building on the internet if we don't really fully understand them? Lastly, I'd like to mention something I think that has actually been missing from the discussion of risk, which I'm referring to as cognitive risk. A good definition of cognitive risk might be the knowledge, beliefs, and values and intentions of all the people and groups that are attacking and defending infrastructure. And so I think we have a lot of habits that sort of preclude us from thinking about some of these things. And so it's important, I think, to focus on identifying risks and being able to speak to systemic risk and to address that as well, and not just cyber risk or physical risk to infrastructure.
So, I know 2020 was a crazy year for almost everyone and everyone in the cyber world as well. They really delivered some powerful examples of cybersecurity risks in 2020. So, what can we learn from them to reduce these risks really moving forward into 2021 and maybe even further on?
Yeah, I think the SolarWinds supply chain attack is essentially a gift that's going to keep on giving for months, if not for years. And I mean that a bit tongue-in-cheek, of course. The most direct lessons, to be learned from the SolarWinds supply chain attack was that there's no risk like third-party risk. The Russian group, identified as APT-29, they probably didn't even have enough people to capitalize on the fact that they had breached 18,000 or more companies with the hack, and having the SolarWinds software distributing a backdoor for them. So I can imagine they actually needed to farm it out to other groups so that they could focus on some of the favorites, the cherry picking, which of the compromised organizations and government agencies like the Department of Commerce and Department of Energy that they had compromised, just to name a few. We'd all like to think that better security hygiene by SolarWinds might have avoided this event, but that's really wishful thinking. Any organization will fall to an attack given sufficient time and resources from an adversary. So it's not really if, but when. And the real failure sits in how we respond. FireEye, for example, deserves our thanks for essentially shooting the hostage with something, kind of akin to what might have happened in an episode of the TV show 24 with Jack Bauer. They gave up the fact of the theft of their red team tools, and they published details on the SolarWinds attack with very admirable speed, transparency, and responsibility. So in sharing that information, they basically robbed the bad actors of much of the value of the assets that they had stolen, the red team tools. So I think it's up to us now to make sure that we address the fundamentals of InfoSec with diligence and conviction and humility. How many of the impacted companies and government agencies didn't even have log files available to confirm or deny that they had been compromised? These are some of the basics that have to be there. Observability is a central tenet to the implementation of zero trust architectures, for example. But we can't even get to that point without good asset management, DNS monitoring, scanning of open source software, and commercial packages and the libraries that they run on.
It's wild that it's a when, not an if. So I'm curious, what are the 3 things that most excite you about the cybersecurity industry?
Yeah, I'd like to introduce a ancient Greek historian and philosopher to help answer that question. Heraclitus was known for saying something along the lines of, "You can never step into the same river twice." And by this, I believe that the world of cybersecurity and the technology around us is like a river, and it's constantly flowing and changing from moment to moment and from day to day. And I think Heraclitus also meant to convey that it's us that changes from day to day as well. So it's not only COVID-19 and lockdown and the pandemic that has changed us and our collective attack surface and vulnerabilities with regard to cybersecurity and risk. So for me, 3 things that excite me most about cybersecurity flow from that quote. One of them, the ever-changing nature of threats. There's never a dull moment as a security officer, either watching a breach happening somewhere else and learning about it, or exploring new tools. There's so many different natures, of threats that are evolving that you'll never be bored. Number 2, I think there's incredible rewards for those that work in the field. And you have to be curious. I feel that's an important characteristic I look for when I'm hiring for my team. And of course, hackers are not always all bad actors. Some of us are just turning the doorknob to see if the door is locked and not to steal or destroy what sits on the other side of that door. So I think it's important to notice and make an important point that not all hackers are bad people. And then number 3, I think we need millions of new recruits to join the battle. Who will bring with them new insights and innovations. I started teaching at NYU this last year, and I really enjoy shaping the minds and the paths of the next generation of information security professionals. And I also want to help bring diversity into the teams of researchers, practitioners, leaders everywhere, because cybersecurity should be a domain that values all kinds of people.
What, in your opinion, are the 5 things that every company needs to know to tighten up its approach to data privacy and cybersecurity?
That's a good list. I have my first on it is to get on the agenda for your next board of directors meeting. If you're a security leader and you haven't done an external security assessment in 2020, you should make that your first next task, because everyone's risk profile has changed drastically this last year. And so there's no way it's remained the same. So get a fresh assessment and get on the agenda for the next board of directors meeting. You may actually have to get your agenda submitted, end of February, mid-February, right about now, to get into a March board meeting, for example, because it takes time. Number 2, I think everyone should pick a framework against which you're going to measure your organization and its growth and its progression and maturity. Take NIST, the cybersecurity framework, NIST CSF. If you don't want to think about it too much, choose that one. It's a really great starter framework, and it provides a bit of a roadmap as well as a checklist of areas in which you can build your program, your security program. Number three, I think that there's a new kind of job description emerging that might be called privacy engineering. And I believe that it's kind of at the intersection of application security, database engineering, and your legal team. GDPR, for example, the European regulations about data privacy, it put this topic onto all of our agendas to make sure that we have privacy by design, to make sure that we have minimization of information that's shared, and that we have well-architected data flows and data management in order to make privacy possible. Number four, when you discuss the items on your risk register, and make sure you spend some time discussing third-party risk. Everyone has a non-trivial amount of vendor risk that needs to be measured and managed, just like SolarWinds pointed out. And then number five, I think that self-assessment of risk and exposure to security threats, it really can't continue at this leisurely pace of sending out annual questionnaires and having people fill out these spreadsheets and send them back and do this once a year for maybe your top vendors. I think we need to have more frequent, and if we're going to have more frequent assessments, we're going to need to automate it. And so I think that's one of the things we can do. We can send out hundreds of these potential questionnaires and find ways to automate the collection of that information and make sure, because the weakest link is the one that the bad actors are going to attack, you have to know what your third party, your supply chain risk is. And that's one of the things that SecurityScorecard helps people do at scale. We have customers with thousands of vendors in their portfolios that they're monitoring every day, like that river of risk that Heraclitus was referring to, and able to act on changes in that security posture in an automated fashion and to maintain good visibility and awareness.
So, Security Scorecard had a great 2020, and you were named a technology pioneer by the World Economic Forum in 2020. So, what working groups have you been engaged with, and what reports can we expect to see coming out of all of these discussions?
Yeah, thank you. That was a great tradition of technology pioneers. Other companies that have been named by the WEF are companies like Twitter and Google and Airbnb and others. And so for us to be named one means that for the next 2 years, we get to participate in the working groups. So I myself was working and am working on 3 different areas. One of them is a strategy and culture working group. Kind of along the lines of what I mentioned before with cognitive risk. We're working on publishing a set of principles for corporate directors to follow regarding cyber risk and corporate governance, and how to do that effectively and how to use that with continuous monitoring, and security ratings plays into that. The other working group is the supply chain working group, of course. That's a natural fit for SecurityScorecard because we built this entire platform to help understand the supply chain. And we're working on developing a holistic risk governance approach to thinking about it. In particular, this particular working group is tied into the oil and gas sector, but really the governance and risk advice can be applied to any sector, not just oil and gas. And then the third working group is a benchmarking working group. So how do we amplify and accelerate the adoption of some of the proven cyber resilience techniques across the industry with modern frameworks and tools, again with an eye towards continuous monitoring and not just having the security assessments happen once per year, but to have event-based assessments. So when there's a breach event, you can automatically send a questionnaire to that vendor and not have to wait until the annual review comes around and then they answer the question, has there been a breach in the last 12 months? You can definitely get a lot faster action out of that. And so you can expect to see some of the fruits of these collaborations with the World Economic Forum to come out in April with the publication of reports and guidance. Which will cascade down, I think, to the National Association of Corporate Directors and other organizations throughout the world.
Well, that is very exciting, and April will be here before we know it. I can't wait to see what has come out of those discussions. So, I don't want to keep you too long today, and I just have one final question for you. So, do you have a story from your experience about a cybersecurity breach that you helped fix or stop that you can tell us?
Yeah, there's one particular story I like to tell. Prior to my time at Security Scorecard, I ran the InfoSec and enterprise architecture at Marvel. And I like to joke it was my job to keep Iron Man safe. And during my first week on the job there, a hacker group known as OurMine, they managed to post some messages on several Marvel Twitter accounts, including Daredevil, Black Panther, Captain America, and some Netflix accounts that we shared with them. It was a benign attack, and they had just said, "Hey, it's our mine," and they offered to help, with security. Namely, they were suggesting that we implement multi-factor authentication for Twitter accounts and Twitter teams. Suffice it to say that a new policy for managing our thousands of superhero character social media accounts was drafted, reviewed, and approved in fairly short order in response to that breach. But I had the huge responsibility, of keeping Iron Man safe while I was there, and I was the head of security, for the comic and movie juggernaut. And of course, if you saw the movie Endgame, you know that what happened to poor Iron Man after I left Marvel. But the main takeaway is that third-party risk is real. And all we need to do is pay attention to it and try to automate it, understand our vendor risk postures, and that's why I think working at Security Scorecard is a really great and natural fit for me, given my long-standing belief that managing vendor risk is a critical imperative for all businesses, regardless of their industry and technical depth.
Thank you, Mike. This was an awesome conversation. We hope to see you again in the future, both virtually and in person.
Great, thanks again.